Okay, so, this time around, we've been diving into some pretty fascinating stuff you sent our way,
Yeah.
all about this sort of push and pull between how companies make money, you know, profit,
Uh-huh.
and the impact they have on everything around them, like on people and the planet. We've been digging into these excerpts from uh, The Future of Work, Part 7, Profit versus Purpose. Can business save the world?
Right.
And the big question, like the one that just keeps popping up, is whether businesses can really be successful, like truly profitable,
Yeah.
without, leaving a trail of negative consequences in their wake,
Mm.
especially given all the challenges we're facing right now.
Oh, absolutely.
From climate change to this widening gap between the rich and the poor, it feels like we're at a bit of a tipping point.
It really does. And what jumps out from these sources right away is this kind of fundamental tension
Yeah,
between the old way of thinking, that maximizing shareholder value is like the ultimate goal for any company,
right, right.
and this growing demand for businesses to actually be ethical, to be responsible.
Yeah.
It's pretty significant when you think about it. I mean, the source actually says that something like 83% of consumers now expect businesses to operate ethically.
Wow.
I mean, that's a huge shift in expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. It really makes you wonder, though, about what's driving this shift,
Hmm.
Is this a real, like, fundamental change in how business is done? Are we actually moving toward a model where purpose really matters?
Right.
Or is some of it, maybe just for show,
Yeah.
like a kind of ethical marketing strategy
Uh-huh. A good
to
question. Yeah.
make companies look good?
That's really the heart of it, isn't it? I mean, these sources make us ask, are we actually seeing a weakening of this age-old idea that a company's only job is to make as much money as possible for its shareholders?
Hmm.
There's more and more evidence that this traditional view is starting to, well, crumble.
Okay, so let's dig into that crumbling a bit. What are some of the signs that this focus on just shareholders, just profit, might be losing its grip?
Well, a couple of things really stand out. One is this growing desire among workers for something more than just a paycheck.
Yeah.
They're looking for workplaces that actually reflect their values, where they feel like they're contributing to something positive, not something harmful.
Right.
They don't want to be part of the problem.
Yeah, makes sense.
And the other thing is the sheer amount of money being poured into these ESG funds, environmental, social, and governance. We're talking trillions of dollars, which suggests that investors are starting to see these factors as crucial to a company's long-term value and risk.
Mm.
It's not just about feeling good anymore. It's
Okay.
about understanding that social and environmental well-being is actually tied to economic stability in the long run.
It's like it's all connected. Okay, so with these big shifts happening,
Right.
let's look at a specific example, like the one the source mentions, Patagonia.
Mm.
Back in 2022, they made a pretty public change to their ownership structure, right?
Yeah.
What exactly happened there, and what does it tell us about this whole profit versus purpose thing?
What's really interesting about Patagonia is how radical their move was. The founder basically gave up ownership,
Mm.
transferred it to a trust and a nonprofit focused on fighting climate change.
Wow.
The idea is that all their profits, something like $100 million a year, will now go towards environmental causes.
That's a huge statement.
It is. It's a big deal, no question.
And the source talks about the different ways people have interpreted this, right?
Right.
Like, what are the different perspectives on Patagonia's decision?
Well, on the one hand, you have people who see it as a genuine commitment to a greater purpose.
Yeah.
They see it as an example of a company putting its money where its mouth is, putting purpose above pure profit.
Mm-hmm.
The employees especially seem to view it this way. They feel like they're part of something meaningful, something that's making a real difference.
Right.
On the other hand, some people are more skeptical. They think it might be a really clever PR move, a way to generate good press and boost their image. But no matter the motivation, you can't ignore the fact that Patagonia's revenue tripled in the decade leading up to this decision. So,
Yeah.
while it remains to be seen whether this model is sustainable in the long term,
Right.
it does challenge that old assumption that profit always has to come first. It shows that maybe you can have both, that profit and purpose can actually work together.
That revenue growth is a pretty powerful argument, isn't it? It kind of flips the script on the whole profit-first idea. The source also brings up the economist Rebecca Henderson.
Yes.
What's her take on this whole profit versus purpose thing?
Well, Rebecca Henderson, in her book Reimagining Capitalism, offers a broader perspective. She basically argues that a healthy planet and a stable society aren't just nice to haves.
Yeah.
They're essential for businesses to succeed in the long run.
That makes sense.
She says that companies need to go beyond just superficial corporate social responsibility reports, the kind that just look good on paper.
Yep.
They need to make fundamental changes to how they operate, to how they're incentivized.
So it's not just about talking the talk, it's about actually walking the walk, really embedding these principles into the company's DNA.
Exactly.
The source also mentions the rise of these ethical business models, specifically B corporations or B Corp. For folks who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick rundown of what a B Corp actually is?
Sure. A B Corp is basically a company that's been certified by this nonprofit organization called B Lab. And this certification means that the company meets really high standards for social and environmental performance,
Yep.
accountability, and transparency. And unlike traditional corporations, B Corp are legally obligated to consider the impact of their decisions on everyone involved, not just shareholders, but also workers, customers, suppliers, the community, even the environment.
So it's a more holistic view, right?
Exactly. It's not just about the bottom line.
And the source points out that there's been a pretty dramatic increase in the number of B Corp, hasn't there?
Oh, yeah, the numbers are pretty impressive. The source says there's been a 300% increase in B Corp since 2015, with over 6,000 companies now certified globally.
Wow.
And this includes some pretty big names like Ben & Jerry's and Eileen Fisher, which shows that this model can work for large companies too, not just small niche businesses.
That's interesting. It shows there's a real appetite for this kind of business model.
Mm.
But the source also makes a point of saying that B Corp is still a pretty small part of the overall economy.
Yeah.
And then it brings up this issue of greenwashing, which is, well, pretty concerning. What exactly is greenwashing, and why is it such a big problem when we're talking about this whole profit versus purpose thing?
Yeah, greenwashing is basically when a company tries to make itself look environmentally friendly,
Right.
sustainable, even when it's not really. They might make misleading claims about their products or launch these big campaigns to create an image of environmental responsibility, but their actual practices don't match up.
So it's like a PR stunt.
Yeah, kind of. And it's a problem because it undermines genuine efforts towards sustainability. It confuses consumers, makes them think progress is being made when it's not. It also erodes trust in companies that are actually trying to do the right thing.
Right. It makes it hard to tell who's genuine and who's just faking it.
Yeah.
The source brings up a really good example of this. Remember BP's Beyond Petroleum campaign back in the early 2000s?
Oh, yeah, that's a classic example.
Can you remind us what happened there?
Well, BP spent a lot of money trying to rebrand themselves. They wanted to move beyond petroleum, even made some investments in renewable energy like solar.
Sure.
But here's the catch. By 2023, a whopping 96% of their investments were still going towards fossil fuels.
Oh, wow. So they were still basically an oil company,
Yeah, pretty much.
even though they were trying to present this image of being something else.
Exactly. There was this huge gap between what they were saying and what they were actually doing.
So what happened as a result of all this? What were the consequences of BP's greenwashing?
Well, the source mentions a couple of things. First, despite their Beyond Petroleum campaign, their emissions actually went up by something like 40%.
Yikes.
And second, maybe even more importantly, it contributed to this overall decline in public trust towards corporations.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When companies make big promises and then don't follow through, people get cynical.
Right.
It makes it harder for anyone to take them seriously.
For sure. Now, to bring this whole discussion down to a more personal level, the source talks about two people, Aisha and Carlos, who have very different experiences with this whole profit versus purpose dynamic. Can you tell us a bit about their stories?
Sure. So Aisha works at a worker-owned cooperative, and her experience is a really good example of how a purpose-driven business model can actually benefit employees. In her cooperative, she has a real voice in company decisions.
Okay.
They vote on policies and things like that. She also shares in the profits.
Oh, interesting.
And the company is really involved in its local community. They even use some of their profits to support affordable housing initiatives.
Wow, that's impressive.
So for Aisha, it's not just a job. It's about being part of something that aligns with her values
Yeah.
and that has a positive impact on the world around her.
It sounds like a much more empowering and fulfilling work experience compared to what a lot of people experience in traditional companies.
Yeah.
Then there's Carlos, who's a gig worker.
Right.
What does his story tell us?
Well, Carlos works for one of those food delivery apps,
Okay.
and they're always talking about sustainability, how they're trying to be environmentally friendly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's actually seen his wages go down.
Oh, wow.
So it's a bit of a contradiction, right? The company is promoting this image of being purpose-driven,
Hmm.
but that purpose isn't really benefiting the workers, especially those who are in more precarious positions.
Yeah, that's a good point. It shows that ethical considerations need to go beyond just marketing and PR.
Yeah.
They need to actually benefit everyone involved in the business.
Exactly.
And this leads us to the idea of the ESG gap, which the source mentions. What is that exactly?
Well, the ESG gap basically refers to this mismatch between how much companies talk about ESG issues, environmental, social, and governance, and how much they actually do about them.
Okay.
The source mentions that while something like 90% of S&P 500 companies publish sustainability reports,
Hmm.
only about 12% actually tie executive pay to things like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or to climate goals.
That's a pretty big gap. So while companies are happy to talk about these issues, they're not necessarily holding their leaders accountable for actually making progress.
That's right. It raises questions about how committed they really are.
Yeah.
If they were serious, wouldn't they be putting their money where their mouth
It
is?
seems like it takes more than just good intentions.
Mm.
The source also talks about this company, Gravity Payments,
Yeah.
and their CEO, Dan Price.
Yeah, Dan Price.
He did something pretty radical with employee compensation, didn't he?
He did. He decided to implement a $70,000 minimum wage for all his employees.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It was. And he did it by cutting his own CEO salary significantly. And the results were pretty amazing. Employee turnover went down by half, and the company's revenue doubled.
That's incredible. It really challenges the idea that paying employees more hurts the bottom line.
It does, but the source also points out that Price faced some negative consequences, some backlash for his decision.
Oh, like what?
Well, some people criticized him, and some banks actually reduced his credit lines.
Oh, wow.
It shows that even when you're trying to do the right thing, trying to create a fairer system, there can be pushback.
It's a reminder that it's not always easy to do the right thing, even when it seems like a win-win.
Yeah.
The source also brings up Anand Giridharadas, the author of Winners Take All.
Yes.
What's his take on how we can really address this profit versus purpose challenge?
Well, Giridharadas is pretty critical of the idea that philanthropy and corporate social responsibility alone can solve these problems. He argues that we need deeper, more systemic changes, things like higher taxes on excessive profits, regulations to prevent stock buybacks, and laws that actually make it unprofitable to exploit workers or the environment.
So it's about changing the rules of the game,
Yeah.
not just relying on companies to do the right thing out of the goodness of their hearts.
Exactly. He's saying that the current system often rewards the very behaviors we're trying to change.
Makes sense. And the source does mention that governments are starting to play a bigger role in this area, like with the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and California's Fair Pay Act. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Sure. So the EU directive is basically trying to hold companies accountable for human rights and environmental abuses throughout their supply chains.
Okay.
They have to do these thorough audits and make sure they're not contributing to these problems.
That sounds like a big step in the right direction.
It is. And California's Fair Pay Act is specifically focused on closing the wage gap between genders and races, trying to ensure that everyone gets paid fairly for the work they do.
So these are examples of governments stepping in and saying, okay, voluntary action is great, but we need some rules in place to make sure things actually change.
Right. Exactly.
But the source also raises this question of whether government regulation can actually keep up with corporations, because companies are always finding new ways to get around rules, to find loopholes.
That's a very valid point. Regulation can be effective, but it has to be comprehensive and well enforced.
Yeah.
And it has to be adaptable because companies are always going to be looking for ways to, game the system.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into part 7 of the future of work, it's clear that this whole profit versus purpose thing is far from settled.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's a really complex issue with no easy answers.
It is. And the source ends on this image of a global coalition working on a manifesto for ethical capitalism, which is kind of hopeful.
Yeah.
It suggests that there's a growing movement of people who are really trying to figure out a better way forward, a way to create a more responsible and sustainable model for business.
It's a good reminder that things are changing, even if it's slow. And it sets us up nicely for what comes next in this series. The source mentions that the next part of the future of work will explore the roles of governments, schools, and even individuals in all of this.
Right?
So it's not just about corporations, it's about all of us and how we can all contribute to a future where work actually benefits humanity, not just profits.
Absolutely. It makes you think, doesn't it? What role do we each play in this?
It does. So, to our listeners, we'll leave you with that question. After everything we've explored today, what do you see as your own role in shaping a future of work that's truly ethical and sustainable? It's a question that's worth pondering as we move into the next stage of this conversation.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.